Noctambula, written and produced by Oliver Arnold. Chapter 6. Bodhi chirped energetically from within his covered cage, his melodic trills cutting through the silence that had settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The bright morning sun streamed through the gauze curtains, casting long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor and projecting the canary's animated little shadow onto the white sheet that draped his home. The silhouette danced with each enthusiastic movement, a tiny performer putting on a show for an audience of dust motes. The cage was still covered. Emily had only just now dragged herself out of bed, her mind foggy and limbs heavy with exhaustion. It was 11 a.m., yet her consciousness barely penetrated the thick veil of fatigue she camped under. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she raised a mug of coffee to her lips. The bitter liquid scalded her tongue, but she welcomed the pain, anything to jolt her system into functioning. She shuffled toward the couch, the floorboards creaking beneath her bare feet. Emily was halfway across the living room when her eyes fell upon the action camera. She paused, coffee mug suspended mid-air, and stared at the little black box tucked away up there on the cabinet where she had left it last night. Its recording light blinked. After setting her mug down on the coffee table with a dull thunk, Emily grabbed the device. Her heart began to quicken, though she couldn't articulate why. It was only a recording, after all, a precaution. Normal people took precautions when living alone in houses. She stared at the camera's blank screen, her pale reflection appearing as a ghostly outline against the dark surface. Her finger trembled as it found the rewind button, then the play button. Emily half expected to see a masked murderer creeping through her front door, but then, if such a thing had actually happened, why was she still breathing? Either the mysterious intruder she had been so convinced was stalking her hadn't actually come last night, or a terrible thought entered Emily's mind. Was this all another one of Patrick's practical jokes? He had previously taken an odd pleasure in frightening her, claiming it was good for her nerves. The camera screen flickered to life, showing the narrow hallway that led to the front door, just the way she had set it up before bed. It wasn't an ideal angle, Emily realized now with growing frustration, but the single exterior door was clearly visible in the frame. The timestamp in the corner read 6:04 p.m., just after she had gone to bed. Absolutely nothing happened on the recording for the first several minutes. The image remained static, unchanging and tedious in its normalcy. Impatience grasped Emily, making her skin itch and her leg bounce nervously. She fast-forwarded through hours of nothingness, the timestamp in the corner racing ahead like a digital speedometer until she slowed it back to normal around 3:17 a.m. She stared at the static hallway image for what felt like an eternity, her eyes beginning to dry and burn from the lack of blinking, her neck cramping from leaning forward toward the small screen. Suddenly, without warning, she noticed movement. The shadow of a person flashed through the frame, a dark, human-shaped silhouette cast against the pale, moonlit wall of the hallway. Emily's breath caught in her throat like a fishbone. She was wide awake now, more alert than she had been in days, as she stared incredulously at the screen with eyes that felt too wide open. The shadow had been unmistakably distinctive, clearly human-shaped and fluid in its movement. But after passing through the frame from right to left, it didn't reappear. It was there one moment and gone the next. "What the hell?" Emily said, her voice sounding too loud in the empty house. She rewound the footage, heart hammering against her ribs, and hit play again. There it was, a shadow, cast by a person walking from right to left, outside of the camera's field of view. Emily leaned closer to the screen, squinting as if that might reveal more details. But no matter how hard she tried, nothing else was visible. Just the shadow, just the suggestion of an intruder. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She got uneasy and looked around her, half expecting a dark figure standing nearby, watching her. The playback continued, and Emily forced herself to keep watching. The recording showed no action for the longest time. But then, from the left, a figure entered the frame. And just like that, Emily herself came into view. The watching Emily froze the frame immediately, her finger pressing so hard on the pause button that her nail bent backward painfully. It was undeniably her on the recording, the same oversized sleep shirt, the same disheveled hair, the same pale skin, but something was fundamentally, disturbingly wrong. She was walking in the most peculiar pose, her back unnaturally curved, her arms hanging limply at her sides, like those of a marionette with cut strings. Her gait was stilted, mechanical, as if she were being controlled by some unseen puppeteer. And her eyes, dear God, her eyes were wide open, completely unblinking, staring fixedly at absolutely nothing with the glassy intensity of a corpse. "I'm sleepwalking?" Emily asked herself. The empty house offered no answers, just the sound of Bodhi chirping. Why? Emily wasn't aware of such a habit any time during her life. There had to be a rational explanation. Stress, perhaps. The isolation of country living after years in the city. Emily splashed cold water on her face, trying to clear her mind. The face that stared back at her from the mirror looked familiar, yet strange, slightly gaunt. Had she lost weight? In the early afternoon, Emily found herself back on the aluminum extension ladder, methodically painting the building's weathered backside with long, careful strokes. The repetitive motion of the brush against the old clapboard siding provided a strange, almost meditative comfort. She could see the fresh white paint covering the peeling gray underneath, and could measure her progress by the neat rows of pristine boards. She was surrounded by a constellation of tools, drinks, and gear that she had accumulated over the morning. Paint cans and brushes, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, a water bottle, various scrapers and sandpaper, a portable radio playing static-filled country music from a distant station. She had been at this particular section for hours now, losing herself in the rhythm of the work. The sun beat down mercilessly on her exposed neck and shoulders, and she could feel her skin beginning to burn despite the mild weather. Bodhi was outside with her, his cage placed carefully in a patch of dappled shade beneath the old oak tree that dominated the backyard. The canary hopped energetically from perch to perch, occasionally bursting into a sharp squawk, as if to remind Emily that she wasn't completely alone in this expanse of countryside. His presence was more comforting than she had expected it to be. When she finally stepped down from the ladder to assess her progress and stretch her back, her vision swam alarmingly. The world tilted at a dangerous angle, as if she were on the deck of a ship in rough seas, and she nearly lost her footing entirely, grabbing desperately at the ladder's rungs for support. Her knuckles went white with the effort of holding on. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the expanding black spots that danced before her eyes like television static, but they persisted stubbornly. She squinted through the window at the grandfather clock that stood sentinel in the hallway, trying to bring the ornate numbers into focus through the glare and her swimming vision, and was shocked to discover that it was 3 p.m. "Why am I so tired?" she asked aloud, her voice carrying across the empty yard and disappearing into the surrounding woods. Bodhi chirped in response, his tiny head cocked to one side as if he were actually considering her question. "Well, because I'm sleepwalking," Emily thought grimly. "Because I'm wandering around my house like a zombie at 3 a.m. A more alarming possibility occurred to her then, creeping into her consciousness like a poisonous snake. What if there was something wrong with the house itself? She recalled disturbing stories she had read about entire families who had fallen mysteriously ill due to carbon monoxide poisoning or gas leaks in their homes, suffering from persistent headaches, crushing fatigue, vivid hallucinations, memory loss, before ultimately... She didn't want to finish that thought. Dropping her paintbrush with a clatter, she bolted around to the side of the house where the propane tank sat nestled against the foundation, among a tangle of weeds and discarded equipment. She dropped to her knees beside it, ignoring the way the damp earth soaked through her jeans. With cautious, deliberate movements, she leaned forward and carefully smelled the reservoir, the connecting pipes, the various valves, and all the surrounding area, inhaling deeply despite her racing heart. Nothing. No telltale rotten egg odor that would indicate a leak, no sinister hissing sound suggesting escaping gas. The tank and its connections seemed perfectly normal, perfectly safe. She sat back on her heels, feeling both relieved and somehow disappointed that she hadn't found such a simple explanation for her disturbing symptoms. "Guess if there were a dangerous gas leak, my canary would have been triggered, she thought, glancing over at Bodhi, who continued to hop about his cage with apparent joy, seemingly unaffected by anything more serious than the occasional passing cloud. Canaries were famously sensitive to toxic gases. That's why miners had used them as early warning systems for decades. Poor Bodhi. I have such terrible thoughts about you, she exclaimed, a desperate, slightly hysterical laugh bubbling up. The joke, if it had been one, fell flat. As if on cue, fat raindrops began to fall from the darkening sky, pattering gently against the half-painted siding and raising tiny dust explosions where they hit the dry earth around the house's foundation. Emily hurriedly gathered her supplies, tossing brushes and paint cans into a large plastic bin without regard for organization. The wind was picking up now, carrying the scent of ozone and the promise of a serious storm. By the time she had collected everything, the radio, the thermos, the scattered tools, the gentle spring shower had transformed into a proper downpour. Heavy drops pelted her shoulders and soaked through her thin t-shirt in seconds. She grabbed Bodhi's cage with both hands, the bird fluttering nervously inside as rain began to strike the bars, and ran for the back door. Her sneakers squelched in the rapidly forming mud, and her clothes were already soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to her skin like a second clammy layer. Inside the kitchen, Emily set Bodhi down carefully on the granite counter and leaned heavily against the closed door, listening to the rain drumming relentlessly against the metal roof like an army of tiny fists. Water dripped from her hair, forming an expanding puddle at her feet. She should turn on the lights to chase away the gathering gloom. She should change out of her wet clothes before she caught her death. She should eat something substantial. When was the last time she'd had a real meal? She did none of these sensible things. Instead, Emily grabbed the action camera and a handful of heavy-duty zip ties and went straight to her bedroom with determined steps. The room felt different in the stormlight, darker, more enclosed, almost cave-like. She attached the device high up on the handle of an upper cabinet door, positioning it carefully to capture the entire bed and most of the room. Her fingers worked with surprising steadiness despite her exhaustion. She pressed the record button and watched the red light begin its steady, hypnotic blinking. Now, and only now, she told herself, would she shower, get dry, and attempt to get some rest. But first, she stood there for a long moment, staring at that blinking red light. Later, when Emily finally lay in her bed, still damp hair slowly soaking her pillow and creating a cool, uncomfortable spot beneath her head, a strange sense of comfort overcame her despite everything. She had dimmed the lights until the room was bathed in soft shadows, but she could still see the red blinking of her camera. Everything would be all right, she told herself repeatedly like a mantra. Patrick would arrive tomorrow with his big laugh and his rational explanations, and together they would figure out what was happening to her. But despite these reassuring thoughts, she was so tired, so very tired, that her bones ached with it. As the storm raged outside and the camera continued its silent vigil, Emily closed her eyes and tried to surrender to sleep, even knowing that morning might bring fresh surprises captured in digital clarity. You've heard Noctambula Chapter 6. Written and produced by Oliver Arnold.